Welcome to Grace Online. My name is Matt, and today we are continuing a series called Asking for a Friend, where we are answering tough questions and messy questions from you about how life and faith intersect. And today we're talking about the origins of, everything. For most of us, we were taught that scientific facts point to evolution and a chance existence. But how do we reconcile that with what the Bible says? Is the Bible just wrong? And if so, can we really believe anything else that's in there? Or is there actual scientific evidence that's pointing towards creation being true? We're answering those questions and more starting right now.
2 months ago, you submitted questions for us to address as a church family from a biblical perspective. And over the last 2 weeks, we addressed identity, gender, and sexuality. And this week, we are addressing the apparent contradiction between science and faith. What do we do with that? Because we were taught one thing in school, and we read another thing in the Bible. What do we do with that? Now, maybe this isn't an issue for you at all. You don't think about it much, but for some of us, it's a really big deal, and it was for me in my 20s. Now, today's teaching is going to be a little bit different in that I've got to cover a lot of cerebral content. So there's not going to be a lot of funny stories or even off the cuff one-liners that sometimes I'm able to throw into teachings because we have so much material to cover. But I struggle with this a lot because I knew that Jesus believed in a literal 6-day creation and Moses believed in a literal 6-day creation. So if Jesus believed that the first book of the Bible should be literally interpreted and it's factually inaccurate, what do I do with that? Like Jesus said in Mark chapter 10, verse 6, but God made them male and female from the beginning of creation. So Jesus said that from the very beginning of when God created everything, male and female existed. And we know from Genesis chapter 1 that they showed up on the 6th day. That's pretty much the beginning. Moses wrote in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them, but on the 7th day he rested. So if they both believed, but it wasn't true, then what does that mean for the rest of the Bible? Like if I can't trust the first book of the Bible, then on what basis would I begin to trust all of the other books of the Bible? So what I want to do is I want to look at the biblical account of creation first, make a few observations, and then we'll look at evolution. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through 8. We're only going to look at the first 2 days of creation today. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters. So the first thing, it's not really in my notes, but the Bible's narrative would indicate that the earth is a water-based planet, which was contradictory to known science for forever until the 1970s when we discovered that, yes, it was a water-based planet, but it was on the very first verse all along. Just pointing that out. Keep going. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and evening passed, and morning came, marking the first day. So it's Moses' description of what an actual day is, an evening and a morning, that leads me to believe in a literal 6-day account of creation. At least I believe that that is what the Bible actually teaches, because Moses says an evening and a morning passed. One concern that people use or share is that God created light on the first day, but didn't create the sun until later. And they said, that's not logical. Well, the sun is where we get light, but the actual existence of light, like you can't touch light, it's a thing that, right? But it's like immaterial. The Bible says that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. So God on the first day says, I'm going to invent this thing called light, and it's going to exist, and that'll be day. And the absence of that will be night. Now, he gave us the sun later as the source of our light, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have created light on the first day. So this isn't a problem for me. Let's go to the second day. Then God said, let there be a space between the waters to separate the waters of the heaven from the waters of the earth. Now that's weird, and I don't know if you've ever thought about that before. But there's a water-based planet. God says, I'm going to separate the water on the earth from the water above the earth. Verse 7 says, and that's what happened. God made this space to separate the waters of the earth from the waters above the earth in the heavens. God called the space in between it sky. And the evening passed and morning came, marking the second day. Okay, so where's that second layer of water that goes around the earth above our atmosphere? It doesn't exist. Well, where did it go? What happened to it? Can you think of anything at all in human history or any narratives, myths, legends you've ever heard that could have explained where all of that water went? And to answer the question, have you ever also wondered, how was there enough water for all of the world to be flooded? The Bible talks about a flood that covered even the highest mountains. Where did that water come from? Okay, there was water that was above our atmosphere before. Now it's not here. And in between then and now, there was a big flood. What do you think happened? Well, when you get to Genesis chapter 10, it says that God opened the windows of heaven and it flooded. It's in Genesis chapter 10 where God broke that water, ice canopy. Now, there's a lot of other secondary theories on what that would have done to the Earth's atmosphere. If there was water above the atmosphere that's exposed to sub-zero temperatures of space, it would have been like ice, would have been an ice canopy. It would have shielded us from the Earth's harmful UV rays, which contribute heavily to aging, which would explain the ages of people who lived before the flood versus after flood. It also could have potentially created a greenhouse effect in our atmosphere where the temperatures between the poles and the equator wouldn't have varied by more than 10 or 15 degrees. And that would explain why they've actually found tropical plants on Antarctica. How else do you explain that? And it also, they say that the barometric pressure and the oxygen richness of our atmosphere could have also explained the sizes of reptiles that existed before the flood, dinosaurs, and where they went after the flood and why they no longer exist. But what I want you to know is that every culture throughout history has had a flood legend, I believe, for a reason, because it actually happened. And it explains a lot of the things that we actually see in nature today. But where do you think we came from, and how did we get here? Did everything in existence come from nothing, or from something, or from someone? If you believe God created everything using the mechanism of evolution, then what do you do with the first 3 chapters of Genesis? Another question would be, is there any evidence to support the biblical account of creation? And I think part 2 of that is, what kind of evidence would it take for you to seriously consider the biblical account of creation more seriously? What I want to do is now I'm transitioning into the actual bulk of the teaching, and I want to start by reading from the foreword to The Origin of Species, written by a guy named George Wald, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for Physiology. Now, physiology is the study of organisms, organ systems, individual organs, cells, and biomolecules, and how they carry out chemical and physical functions in a living system. So this guy is super smart, and he knows about biology. And he writes the foreword to The Origin of Species, which is like the Evolution Bible. And here's what he says. He wrote, "When it comes to the origin of life, there are only 2 possibilities, creation or spontaneous generation. There is no third way. Spontaneous generation was disproved 100 years ago, but that leads us to only one other conclusion, that of supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance." So the first objection, he says, to creation is a philosophical one, not a scientific one. He acknowledges that the spark of life and the beginning of evolution's molecule to man theory is actually contradictory to known scientific fact. But because he doesn't want to believe in God, he chooses to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. So then let my first objection to evolution also be a philosophical one as well. Because evolution is basically the survival of the fittest. and that adaptations to your environment are passed down genetically to succeeding generations for advancement. So basically, mankind is just an animal. An evolved one, for sure, and advanced, but simply an animal. We have no greater purpose. There is no grand plan. We're just an animal like all of the other animals in the world. Which leads to the idea that only the fit should survive. Because in the animal kingdom, animals born with defects are abandoned or destroyed. They aren't taken care of and nurtured and sheltered because they don't want those genes being passed down to the generation. And it's that line of thinking that led Darwin to write in The Descent of Man. Here's what he said. At some future point, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Darwin's line of thinking, and if you carry it out to its extent, the rational conclusion of humanistic evolution is that those ethnicities that are more fit to survive, in his estimation, or are stronger, have every right to exterminate those other ethnicities that don't measure up. That led Francis Galton to pioneer the study of eugenics. He said, if the unfit survive indefinitely, they will continue to infect everyone else with their less fit genes. So in 1833, he proposed the concept of eugenics, which advanced using selective breeding to improve human hereditary traits. He argued that social interventions on behalf of poor people or physically disabled people were counterproductive because they enabled those people to survive and possibly even reproduce when natural selection, given enough time, would have weeded those people out of the population anyway, so why help them? Human evolution can and should be guided by selectively breeding people with desirable mental and physical traits. This could eventually supplant natural selection and create an ideal human race. Okay. That makes me uncomfortable, and it probably does you also, because his ideas eventually were rejected as deeply flawed and unethical because they promoted racism and social Darwinism. And eugenics ultimately gave rise to coercive state sterilization programs and eventually even the Nazi genocide of the Jews. But on what scientific basis was eugenics rejected? It was a moral choice. But this moral choice that they used to reject eugenics is inconsistent with the actual theory of natural selection. Because for evolution to succeed, it is necessary that the unfit do not survive for the survival of our species. Ronald Fisher is not a Christian. He's an English statistician and evolutionary biologist, and he wrote The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, and here's what he said. Natural selection is the blindest and most cruel way of evolving a new species. The struggle for life and the elimination of the weakest is a horrible process against which our entire modern ethic revolts. I am surprised that a Christian would defend that idea as the process by which God would have created the universe. Philip E. Johnson, a Christian and law professor at UC Berkeley and co-founder of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute, said this: an intelligent designer would not have employed such a random, cruel experiment to invent life. And truthfully, neither would an intelligent designer have to use that process. So if evolution were true, we should have no problem with extermination of those who are less desirable and unfit. But if creation were true, and we do have the thumbprint of God in our hearts and are created in the image of God, unlike the animal kingdom, then you would expect people in general to abhor the idea of the oppression of the weak by the strong. And we do. And that is my philosophical problem with evolution. I have other problems with evolution, and that's what I'd like to use the second half of the teaching for today. And the first is the fossil record, because there are no verifiable transitions from one species to another that has ever been found in the fossil record. Colin Patterson is the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, and they have the largest collection of fossils in the entire world. And he wrote the authoritative book called Evolution. And in that book, he confessed, if I knew of any evolutionary transitions, fossil or living, I would have included them in my book. And he didn't because they don't exist. Now, Darwin knew that there were no transitionary fossils also. And he asked, why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitionary forms? So he says, if we've got this species, and I believe it transitioned into this species over millions of years, where are all of the other species in between there? Like, why don't they exist? David Ropp, the curator for the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, said that we are now, at the time, 120 years past Darwin, and we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. How is it possible to have less? Because things that they thought might have been, we have now been able to prove that they're not transitionary fossils at all. There's nothing. They don't exist. So if we're going to believe that the theory of evolution is true and everything evolved into something else, but there's no physical evidence for this, what do? Well, a guy named Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould introduced a new concept in 1972 called punctuated equilibrium. And they wrote that a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of ancestors. It appears all at once, so it just jumps from this species to this species. But the problem with this theory of punctuated equilibrium is that it's motivated by a lack of evidence. There's actual no evidence at all to support this theory. It's simply constructed as a way to explain why there is no evidence for evolution. The second problem with it is that it contradicts the known science of genetics. And Duane Gish, who is a PhD UC Berkeley biochemist, wrote, the genetic apparatus of a species, of an animal, is devoted 100% to reproducing another exactly like it. So he says, the more that we study genetics, the more we know that a species is programmed to produce another thing exactly like it. There are no jumps. It's not programmed for that. Genetically, that's not possible. Colin Patterson, an evolutionist, and thinking through this, wrote this, and this quote is a little bit long, but it's really good. So I'm going to read it. He said, for over 20 years, I thought I was working on evolution. But then I realized that there's not one thing that I actually know about it. So for the last few weeks, I've tried putting a simple question to various people and groups of people. And the question is this: can you tell me anything that you know about evolution? Any one thing that is absolutely true. He said, I tried that question on the geology staff at the Field Museum of Natural History, and the only answer I got was silence. I tried it on the members of the Evolutionary Morphology Seminar in the University of Chicago, a very prestigious body of evolutionists, and all I got there was silence for a long time, until eventually one person spoke up and said, yes, I do know one thing. It ought not to be taught in high school. He goes on to say that during the past few years, you have experienced a shift from evolution as knowledge to evolution as faith. Evolution not only conveys no knowledge, but seems now to somehow convey anti-knowledge. But if creation were true, the fossil record would look exactly like it does. Another objection I have with the theory of evolution is Darwin's tree of life. You may have seen a diagram of Darwin's tree of life. And as I've just mentioned, the fossil record actually doesn't support the tree of life. Darwin knew this, that the fossil record failed to support his theory and that the divisions that we now call phyla appear in the fossil record suddenly. And he wrote this: if numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life all at once, That fact would be fatal to my theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection. And what he was hoping for is that eventually time would show that his theory was correct. But as has already been mentioned, time has actually demonstrated that there is no evidence of transitionary evolution from one species to another. What we actually see in the fossil record is what we call the Cambrian explosion. Now, to explain this, and I'm listen, this might be one of those teachings, like half of you guys are like dialed in and the other half are like, oh my gosh, why did I show up today? And I am 100% sorry for that. But if you were to take time in the fossil record and turn it into a football field with 100 yards and you stood it up on end and you made the 1 yard line at the very beginning where we see simple-celled organisms, all right? You would have to go to the 10-yard line, the 20, the 30, the 40, the 50, the 40, the 30, the 20, and all the way you would get to the 16-yard line on the whole other side of the football field before you would see things like sponges, jellyfish, and worms. But then only one step later in the fossil record, you get all of the other forms of life all springing up at the same time. Bro, there is no tree of life. It's a whole stinking forest that all started at the exact same time, which is exactly what you would see if you accepted the historical reliability of the Genesis account of creation. My fourth objection with evolution is in relation to Miller's experiment. A guy named Stanley Miller set up an origin of life simulation that showed amino acids could form spontaneously from inorganic compounds when put together in a controlled environment and then given electrical impulses, electrical shocks. It was used to demonstrate that amino acids, which are the building blocks for proteins, could form on their own. Now, the environment that Miller chose for his experiment was a hydrogen-rich mixture of methane, ammonia, and water vapor. Why did he choose this? We don't know. Is there any evidence for that being the conditions of Earth's environment at the beginning? There's absolutely none. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary. In fact, according to the Science magazine article that was written in 1995, experts now dismiss Miller's experiment because early atmosphere looked nothing like the Miller-Urey simulation. They now believe that the atmosphere was probably carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor, and then they performed the experiment again and proudly announced that it also produced organic molecules. And guess what those organic molecules are? Formaldehyde and cyanide, which would, as you know, prevent life from ever happening. Francis Crick, he's a biochemist, said, an honest man armed with this knowledge, the knowledge now available to us, can only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. And I would say, bro, it is a miracle. And the Bible is the one that actually gives us an explanation for that miracle. Walter Bradley, an origin of life expert who taught at Texas A&M, said, if there isn't a natural explanation and there doesn't seem to be the potential of even finding one, then I believe it's appropriate to look at a supernatural explanation for the origin of life. I think that's the most reasonable inference based on the evidence that we actually have. My next objection, I'm flying through these. My next objection is the actual geological column, because there is no documented proof as to the process that formed the rocks in the geological column or their ages. In fact, the order that you see in the geological column in the textbooks is constructed based on the assumption that evolution is true, and organic evolution of a simple-celled to complex took millions of years. And so when they find something, they say, okay, that simple cell that goes on the bottom, that's complex, it goes on the top. And then they arrange the strata according to the various types of fossils on the assumption that evolution is true, and then use that structure that they fabricated to prove that it is true. And you and I both know that what that's called, and that's called circular reasoning. And the problem is that nowhere in the world do you actually find the geological column in the order that it's presented in the textbooks. And there are a ton of anomalies, like fossils found in the wrong layer of strata. So you've got this simple cell that goes on the bottom. It's billions of years old, but it's got something from way up here that wasn't existent until billions of years later, and it's way down here. That actually exists, those anomalies. And those fossils that are too low in the strata, they call stratigraphic leaks. And the idea, what they say is that all of the rock underneath that fossil must have gotten soft and turned to mud, and then that fossil sank into layers it didn't belong in, and then all of that mud above it became rock again. That must be how that got there. And then fossils that supposedly went extinct billions of years before these other organisms that made it up here, they call those reworked specimens. And the idea is that, or what they say is what must have happened is all of the rock above it turned to mud, and there must have been a bubble under there that pushed that fossil way up into the strata where it didn't belong, and then all of the mud below it turned to rock. Why must that have happened? Well, it must have happened for them to be consistent with their theory that doesn't actually fit what we see in the geological column. And in many cases, there are huge thicknesses of strata that are found in the completely wrong order. In fact, in the Glacier National Park here in the US, there's a Precambrian limestone that is 1 billion years old on top of Cretaceous shale, which is only 100 million years old. So how did this rock that's 10 times older end up on top of something that's 10 times younger? This should be on the top. So why is it like this? So they said that what must have happened is this lifted up, moved over for 900 million more years until more ground could fall and then turn into rock. And then this was slid back over. The problem with that is that this misplaced limestone is 350 miles long north to south, 35 miles wide east to west, and 6 miles thick. Even if the sliding planes were lubricated, it's been demonstrated conclusively that this is physically impossible. If the geological column was laid down slowly over the course of eons, then you can't explain polystrata fossils like trees. How do you have a tree that's organic in nature slowly get covered up over millions of years and never decay? How do you have a fossilized tree in different layers of rock perfectly preserved? There's no explanation for that in the evolutionary model, but in the creation model, with the understanding of a worldwide flood and the layers of sediment being different movements at the bottom of the ocean's floor during the flood, which would also explain why all of the geological column, you see it curving as though it was soft, which it was because it was at the bottom and formed during the flood. I'm just saying the creation model actually fits what we see in the geological column, and the evolutionary model doesn't explain it. Another problem I have with the evolutionary explanation for the beginning of the universe and for the evolution of man specifically is Haeckel's embryos. Now, the problem with this diagram, which is still being taught, by the way, is that photos of actual embryos and Haeckel's drawings of these embryos don't match. Similarities in the early stages have actually been proven to have been faked by him. And in some cases, he used the same woodcut because he was so confident that he was right. And in other cases, he completely doctored them. The truth is that his drawings were exposed to be fraudulent by his own peers and colleagues during his lifetime in the 1860s. Now, Stephen Jay Gould, the Harvard evolutionist, was asked about these drawings, and he admitted that he had known for over 20 years that Haeckel's embryos was fraudulent. And he said academic writers should be ashamed of the way that the drawings have been mindlessly recycled for over a century, and he called it the academic equivalent of murder. So why are they still teaching it? And the answer was this: although the drawings are false, they teach a concept that is basically true, but known to be false. And I checked with all three of my kids who were taught science at Stoughton High, and even today in Stoughton, these drawings are still used to prove the theory of evolution. What about human and ape genetic similarities? You may have heard that we share 98 to 99% of the same genes as chimpanzees. Well, I don't think that is surprising at all that two organisms with similar anatomy have similar genetics or material makeup. Like if you were to chemically analyze a sidewalk in a street, you would see that they're made of the exact same material, but that doesn't mean that they come from a common ancestor. I would say it also, and probably more accurately, demonstrates that they were created by the same designer who used the same material to build or create two different things out of the same genetics. What I want to do is I want to show you a few more examples of genetic similarities between humans and other objects to demonstrate what I mean, that the same creator just used the same material to make different things, but that does not mean that they come from the same ancestor. For instance, humans share 90% the same genetic makeup as a mouse. That's crazy. We're 98% the same as a chimpanzee, 90% the same as a mouse. We're 90% the same as a cat. We're 90% the same as a horse. We're only 84% the same as a dog, and that makes me very sad because I love dogs so much more than cats. We're 60% the same as chickens, and we are 60% the same as a banana. We're made of the same material, but being made of the same material is not evidence for sharing the same ancestor. What about the march of evolutionary man? And you've seen this where the guy's like bent over, and then he's bent over, and then the last one he's naked and carrying a briefcase. The Nebraska man is one of those guys, and he was discovered in 1922. And that entire drawing of the Nebraska man comes from one tooth that was later proven to be from a wild pig. Homo erectus, discovered in 1891 by Eugene Dubois, on the East Indian island of Java, comes from a skull cap, one femur, and 3 teeth. The femur, by the way, was found 50 feet away. So I think we could rationally assume it doesn't belong with a skull cap and the 3 teeth. Now there's a Salinka expedition, and it was the most fact-finding expedition ever on Homo erectus, and they produced a 342-page scientific report that demonstrated beyond doubt that Homo erectus, or Java man, because that's the name of the island he was found on, played absolutely no part in the human evolution. Piltdown man was proven to be an outright fraud, and it was 3 orangutan teeth, that's what the whole thing was built on, that were filed and manipulated. Peking man was originally based on 1 tooth discovered in China by a Canadian physician. As his funds were running out for his evolutionary exploration in 1927. And based on that 1 tooth, his funding was renewed for 2 more years, during which time he found 14 skulls and a collection, by the way, 14 skulls with a bashed-in base of the skull cap. He found tools and teeth. The famous Professor Marcelin Boulay was brought out to confirm that this was a new step in the evolution of man. And he wrote about how angry he was at traveling halfway around the world to see battered monkey skull, because it turns out that the tools that were found with these bashed-in skulls were not used by the inhabitants of those skulls, but were actually used on them. And that Peking man was not a relative of man, but was more likely dinner for man. But if creation is true, we wouldn't be surprised to see an absence, or to not see any fossilized evidence of a transitionary from ape to man. So what are the chances that everything got the way that it is by natural selection? Jacques Monod, a Nobel Prize-winning biologist, said, "Chance alone is the source of every innovation and all creation in the biosphere. Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, is at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution." All right, so it's of all chance, then what is the mathematical probabilities? Because that's what we're talking about with chance. Is evolution logical from a random chance perspective? And what's crazy about this is if you look at everything as it actually is, it's so wonderfully complex. I think it would be like looking at St. Paul's Cathedral in London and saying that got there on its own without giving any credit to Christopher Wren. Or looking at the Messiah and say that it existed, it came into being all by itself without its composer, Handel. Or looking at the beautiful painting of the Last Supper and say that it came into being without its painter and author, Da Vinci. And regarding just the human eye and the human eye's existence, the idea that this would have evolved all on its own, Darwin himself wrote. To suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely admit, absurd in the highest degree possible. You're right. The human eye could not have, like all of the parts and pieces would have had to, and there's thousands, all of the parts and pieces would have had to evolve all at the exact same time in perfect working order for the human eye to work. Dr. James Coppedge, who is an expert on the science of probability, says that chance requires 10 billion tries to pull out 10 random coins in order 1 to 10. So if I pick 10 coins and I numbered them 1 to 10, put them in a bag and shook them up, for me to randomly reach in and pull them out and just put them in order 1 through 10 would take 10 billion tries. Or if it took me 5 seconds for each try, it would take 1,500 years to pull out just the numbers 1 through 10 in order. But the difference intelligence makes? A child can do that in a few seconds. What it would take chance, 1,500 years to do. So when we look at everything, the more rational explanation is intelligent design, a creator rather than a random chance. A child can spell the theory of evolution with Scrabble tiles in a couple of minutes. But by chance, with all of the Scrabble tiles, to pull out the letters for the theory of evolution would take 5 million times longer than the assumed age of the earth to do just that. Coppedge says the probability of a single protein molecule being arranged by chance is 1 in 10 with 161 zeros behind it. That's just for one single protein molecule. Scientifically, anything with a greater chance than 1 in 10 with 50 zeros is mathematically impossible. And he said for a single protein, it's 161 zeros. For a minimum set of the required 239 protein molecules for the smallest theoretical life, the probability is 1 in 10 with 119,831 zeros times the assumed age of the earth to get one protein molecule. Bro, evolution is impossible. It is mathematically and scientifically impossible and contradictory to actual facts. The first and second law of thermodynamics. Man, I just got a couple of minutes here. The first law of thermodynamics is energy conservation, that energy can be converted, but it can neither be created or destroyed. Isaac Asimov, the biochemist, said that it is the most powerful and fundamental generalization about the universe. Neither mass nor energy can appear from nothing. It is a scientific fact that nothing can come from nothing. And evolution presupposes a contradiction to that scientific law. Entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, says that everything moves from order to disorder, from complexity to decay. In other words, a house moves to a pile of wood on its own, but a pile of wood never in a million, billion, billion, trillion years will on its own become a house. Everything devolves. Nothing in the universe on its own advances. Everything moves from order to chaos. So evolution, atoms allegedly self-produce amino acids to auto-organize amoebas to go from amoebas to mankind. So evolution requires billions of contradictions for billions of years, for billions of species, to the second law of thermodynamics. And Arthur Eddington, the British astronomer, physicist, and mathematician, said, if your theory, whatever it is for the origin of life, is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it to collapse in deepest humiliation. Okay. And that's why I'm not an evolutionist. But I have good news. I believe that science and faith are not mutually exclusive. And I want to give you 4 things in science that I believe would help an honest observer become pointed to creation. And the first is new cosmology. It's the idea that the Big Bang theory points to the beginning of the universe. The fact that energy, matter, space, and time had a beginning is anti-materialistic. General relativity points us to something non-material as the cause, and theism, the belief in a God, is the only thing to affirm the existence of such a thing. M.O. Penzias, the Nobel Prize winner, said, "The best data that we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the first 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the rest of the Bible as a whole." The second thing in science that I believe points to a creator is anthropic fine-tuning. The laws and parameters of physics have precise numerical values that could have been otherwise, yet they all work together perfectly to make life on Earth possible. If it were changed by, and this is a quote, "one part in either way, any of those systems, by 1 in a trillion, then our universe could not support life." Sir Fred Hoyle, the English astronomer, noted for his contribution to the theory of stellar nucleosynthesis, said, "A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature guiding us at all. Nothing blind. There is something at work behind all of this, or none of it would exist." The third is the origin of life. Life at its root requires information which is stored in the DNA. Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, said that the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Well, computers run on software designed by intelligent engineers. And every piece of information, code, hieroglyphs, a book, cave painting, all point toward intelligence. Then why wouldn't the same be true about the information stored in every living creature? Stephen Meyer, the American philosopher of science, said, "We're not inferring intelligent design because the naturalistic evolutionary theories fail to explain information. We infer design because all those theories fail and we actually know of a causal entity that is capable of producing information, namely intelligence." And the fourth thing in nature that points to a creator is design in molecular machines. Integrated, complex biological organisms need various parts to function. You may have heard of irreducible complexity, meaning that they need every part in its perfect spot for it to work at all, like a mousetrap. Take any one thing out and the whole thing falls apart. It could never slowly evolve piece by piece because there'd be no mechanism to keep it moving in that direction. It would have all had to evolve at all, and that's just 5. They perform no function at all until all parts are present and working. And natural selection has been demonstrated to not be able to help you build these kinds of systems. And the truth is, I believe there is plenty of evidence I've already shown you evidence for why I believe in creation. I should believe there's a ton of evidence for it not even being too crazy long ago. Take a look at the half-life of Earth's magnetic field and double it every 1,400, 1,500 years going back in time. You'd only have to go back 21,000 years, doubling Earth's magnetic field every 1,500 years, to get to the place where Earth's magnetic field would be as strong as a smaller magnetar, which is a magnetic star, meaning that our atmosphere would not be able to support life just 21,000 years ago. When you look at the petroleum and natural gas, they're contained at high pressure in underground reservoirs that have and then calculations based on the permeability of the cap rock reveal that oil and gas pressures could not be maintained for much longer than 10,000 years. So those oil reservoirs can't be millions of years old, or their cap rocks would have already let loose by now. Recent experiments demonstrate conclusively that conversion of marine and vegetable matter into oil and gas can actually be done in a surprisingly short amount of time. Plant-derived material has been converted into a good-grade petroleum in as little as 20 minutes under the right conditions. This proves that the formation of coal, oil, and gas did not necessarily require millions of years. Creationists believe that the great coal deposits of the world are the metamorphosed remains of the extensive vegetation in the flood. This is further supported by the existence of human skeletons and artifacts like an intricately designed gold chain found in coal deposits, which are supposedly hundreds of millions of years old. The rotation of the Earth is slowing down at a consistent rate. If we're billions of years old, we would be stopped. Or at our current speed, if you speed it up going back in time and we're billions of years old, we would be shaped like a frisbee and all of land masses would be gathered together at the equator. There's more. I just don't have time for it. What if you still disagree? Can you be a Christian and be an evolutionist? The answer is yes. I'm not questioning your faith or your relationship with God. To be saved, to be reconciled to God, you only need to believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus as the payment for your sin. You need to repent and turn from that sin to begin following Jesus. That's all it takes. But my question that I want you to begin asking is, why do you reject the creation account? I don't think that it's necessary. That's all. I hope that's been helpful. There's a whole lot I had to skip, but we're already over time. If you would bow your head with me and we'll pray. God, I'm thankful that the heavens and earth declare the handiwork of God, as David said. Like we can see the existence of you in everything that we look at. Now, on philosophical grounds, sometimes we refuse to accept that, so we make conscious choices to look in a different direction. Others of us, God, just never knew there was another reliable or viable option for the origin of life here. And I pray that you would just help them continue asking questions. God, let your will be done in us and through us. I'm thankful for the confidence that I have in the historical reliability of the scriptures and what it says about who you are and who I am. And I love you with all of my heart for that. In Jesus' name, amen.
Man, I really hope that you found this teaching helpful, because we all want to believe that we are intelligent, rational people, but feeling like we need to choose between science and faith can really be confusing. But the good news is that you don't have to compromise either to be a critical thinker. You can believe that God created the heavens and the earth and still engage thoughtfully with our culture. And if you find yourself still having barriers to faith because of what science, what your teachers, or even a previous church experience is telling you, we want to help. See, our goal here is to help you process through these barriers so that you can grow closer to God and experience the life that He has for you. So if you have any more questions, you want to start a conversation, or even ask for prayer, I am here for that. Just use the info that you see on your screen below. That's for now. We'll see you next time.